around churches isn't just a matter of being spiritual, but there is a reason why I've spent so much time focusing on that. I'm trying to get this idea in on you so that after this, you will begin to explore this area and you will begin to start looking at how do I nurture spirituality in myself, but also how do I nurture it in the church and how do we become collectively more experiential. Now I'm going to talk about how do you actually lead people in that way. The first thing is just recognizing one of the biggest things pastors complain about is church resistance. I need you to understand something really important. Resistance to whatever your idea is, that's actually normal. Let me explain it in a different way. How many of you have ever heard somebody say, yeah, I went to counseling 2 or 3 times, it didn't work, so I quit? How many of you have ever heard somebody say something like that? Do you know why it doesn't work in the first 2 or 3 sessions? Because therapists recognize that everybody is naturally resistant. And everybody who comes to counseling is resistant. We work with our therapists on what we call retention, which is teaching them how to nurture a relationship that keeps people coming back, not indefinitely, but through healing. That often what happens in the first 2, 3, or 4 sessions, the therapist is really working on the relationship. They're working on what's the connection between us. How do I kind of understand who you are so I can help you to trust me so that we can eventually dig into the deeper stuff of whatever we need to talk about. It's important to understand resistance in your church because it helps you to understand ways of overcoming it. Number 1, resistance happens because people don't feel safe. One of the things that's typical of pastors, especially new pastors, you go into a church and you want to make changes and they resist you. But then you say, but the search committee said they wanted this. And why did they lie to me? And I always tell people, they didn't lie to you. You came in wanting to fix them. You didn't help them feel safe. Remember what I talked about when Jill asked your question before, and I told you about the process we would go through in making changes, make them small in the fall, all of that. And I also talked about how we would over-communicate change, and we were also willing to go back if it didn't work. Why did we take so much effort to do that? Because change doesn't feel safe. My whole psychology is, if we're going to do this, how do we help people feel safe? Because churches, especially churches that have been in decline, often are in a permanent state of insecurity. And the more they decline and the more they struggle, the more they move to a survival level way of being. You cannot help people grow by pushing them, berating them, or being angry with them. Recognize that their resistance is normal and it's happening because they don't feel safe. If you can come at it that way, you'll be much more effective in recognizing they don't feel safe. What can I do to help them feel safe? Most pastors don't approach it that way. Really, churches that grow have pastors that do. Trust overcomes resistance, but trust is earned, not given. 60 years ago, maybe, I think a lot of pastors, if you just moved into your position, you automatically have the trust of your congregation. That doesn't happen anymore. The average pastor now stays in a church between 3 and 5 years. It's the same thing that's in our culture, a distrust of institutions. Just because you're a pastor doesn't mean they're automatically going to trust you. Trust is earned, not given. So the question is, what are we doing to earn their trust? It has to do with the way we preach. So for example, if you preach a shaky finger sermon at people, what does that do to trust? If you want people to become more welcoming, but you say, you all aren't very welcoming, you think you are, but you're not, what does that do to trust? Why would they trust you if you're saying that? Losing your temper. When people lose their temper with you, does it increase or decrease trust? When you avoid conflict and just try to smooth everything over, does that increase or decrease trust? For the most part, it decreases because you earn trust. Keep that in mind. Resistance is normal, even though the Borg would say it's futile. Resistance is normal. It happens because people don't feel safe. Trust overcomes resistance. Good leaders help others feel safe in the face of change. So if you're thinking about change, don't get just caught up in the idea of change. Think about, how will I do this in a way that helps people to trust me and trust the process? And I'll talk about that in a bit more. Bad leaders see resistance as the enemy and they attack it. It's just like going to a therapist. You've got a problem, you've suffered trauma, but you won't talk about it. If the therapist goes, there's trauma in there, but you don't trust me, you need to trust me, what's going to happen? They're going to go find another therapist, as opposed to, man, I know this is so difficult to talk about. What you have gone through is not fair. It's not right for you. And you can take as much time as you need to talk with me about that. Which is one of the reasons why whenever we invoke change, one of the things we did to turn around Samaritan, when I first came, I feel it's okay to say this now publicly, we were running a $158,000 deficit. Beth can tell you that was maybe Beth was always like, are you okay? Are you okay? Because you would always kind of go like, they didn't let you know this. And I had come from places where we're always running surpluses and we had to turn the place around. And so what I ended up doing was talking collectively about 15 executive directors from around the country who are running good centers and asking them, well, what do you do? What are your common practices? We had our clinical director talk with clinical directors across the country about how they did everything. We had our director of operations talk with people all around Pittsburgh. How do you do everything? And then we took a year to put together a program that changed the way we did salaries, compensation, the way we structured everything, that then led to growth where we're now running surpluses. But it took a while. It took a long time to make these changes. And even when we made the changes, we went to the therapist and said, the changes we've made, if you do this, you're going to increase your salary by $20,000 to $30,000 a year. Because if you make more money, we're going to make more money. But if you choose not to do it, we will grandfather you in and let you stay at what you're doing right now. So we got them to trust us, and all of them came to the style we're doing. I won't go into the details of how you do that, in a counseling center, because it's very different from churches. But great leaders reduce resistance by adapting to it. I'm going to go over these really quickly because I want you to turn around and come back. And I know the type is really small, but I'd actually like you to make a mental note to take time to think about these things on your own, because I think these are things that are self-reflective. Principles of overcoming resistance. Do the unexpected. Churches are used to being criticized, abandoned, blown over, neglected, and chastised by pastors for not changing. So focus on showing compassion, understanding, and honoring the pain of the past. Don't just tell them the past is the past. One of the things I did at Calvin Church was I helped people talk about struggles from the past in the church. And I didn't say, I'm the new sheriff in town, things are going to be different. I did it in a way like a therapist would, which is, listening to it and honoring it, and also never seeing my predecessor as the enemy. A lot of times in ministry, we think if we go into a church, we have to fix all the problems from the previous pastor. I became really good with my predecessor who had been there for 18 years, and the church had declined under him, but I never looked at it as it was his fault. It was just, that was what was going on in the church. And so I picked his brain. What did you do? What did you try? What worked? What didn't work? And with the members, I would listen to this stuff and honor their pain. Also, slow the pace. In the face of frustration, our tendency is to speed up the pace and put more pressure on people. When we're trying to change the church and they push back against us, if we don't run away, a lot of us, we tend to speed it up. We tend to push it harder. My experience is slow it down. It reduces anxiety, it nurtures trust, and allows details to more naturally emerge. Another is respect the resistance. Recognize the resistance as a legitimate response to past struggles. If you do that, it honors church leaders and their fear, and it dispels anxiety. Resist the urge to confront. Often when I was in seminary, we were taught when there are problems in the church, you have to confront it. And I am not someone who runs away from conflict or problems. But I also know that confronting resistance increases resistance. So saying to people, why are you so resistant to my ideas? But why do you always push back? I'm trying to move you forward. We're doing this for good reasons. Instead, step back and go, okay, well, when I do this, what are your experiences? Okay, how can I change this in a way that'll help us to move along? Is that making sense, what I'm saying? Another thing is resist being the expert. You are there to help nurture them, not to be the religious expert. So help them develop expertise that allows them to be partners in change with us. The more resistant they are, the less expert we can be. The more trusting they are, the more expert we can be. So that's a vague statement. What does that mean? If they've been struggling for a long time, then what it means is taking things slow and try to understand things from their experiences. But also it means training them for what you want. One of the things that I notice in the mainline church, we don't train people for almost anything. Maybe if they become elders. We don't train people. We don't teach them the skills they need to become better at what they are. When I do consultations with churches, we spend almost the first 3 or 4 months reading books that I'm trying to get their education up to my level. If we're trying to change the church, I have them read books on church transformation. I have them, I'm consulting with a church right now. I had them watch the movie Jesus Revolution. Has anybody seen that? About the changing of what's the chapel called? What? Yeah, Calvary. Yeah, it was, and because I'm trying to get them to understand change. I had them read Adam Grant's Think Again, which is, he's a psychologist, and it's all about how do you think differently. I have them reading Walt Callisted's Turn Your Church Inside Out, which is how do you create a church for others. I'm trying to educate them to a higher level so that they can become more of the experts. Eventually what I do is I have them go out and visit different churches so they can learn what other churches do, so they can be an expert in understanding the dynamics of growing churches, so that I'm not the one who's the expert. What happens is the more expert they become and the more they trust me, the more they'll ask questions of me and allow me to guide them. But as long as I'm coming in as the expert, or as one pastor years ago once said to his session, this is like 20 years ago, and after he left, somebody told me that. And they said, he used to tell us, we're going to discern what God's calling us to do, but because I've gone to seminary, I know what discernment is. Because you're laity, you don't. So we're going to discern, and I'll be telling you what God wants for us. There are a lot of people who do that. Focus on where the church is stuck. Be sensitive to it rather than treating it as an indictment of the whole church. Reframe resistance in positive terms. Be aware of how the resistance may actually be trying to preserve something cherished. If they are holding on to something they love, don't just try to change it. Don't confront them with, why are you holding on to this? But ask the question, why is it that it's so important that the piano is over there? Why is it so important not to change? How can I meet you where you are so that we're changing it, it's not me changing it? Yes?
I think that was really important.
Yeah, go ahead.
A lot of times resistance comes in very negative terms.
Yes.
So it's complaining about what's wrong.
Yep.
And so just being able to say, hey, sounds like you have an idea of what you would like it to be. Tell me about that.
Yes.
I'd like to frame that.
Yeah. And that's so important to engage them in it rather than telling them what it is. And this really hits with, yeah, go ahead, Lauren.
Oh, no, keep finishing your thought.
No, go ahead, because I was going to go to the next thought.
Oh, well, like, what if you have a group, like your church is like split on like moving with a change, like say in like a space in the church, like you're moving the piano or you're taking the stage out, or you have half of a group who is like, let's go, we're ready. Another half who's like, well, wait a minute.
Yeah.
Is resistant. So like, is that a conversation that you as the pastor like have with that group? Or
I think it's a conversation, no. And I'm about to address that right now. So let me come back to that, okay? Keep your question and then ask me that question in about 5 or 10 minutes, okay? Because this is my part where I'm moving to get the heck off point. If there is a biggest thing for me to say as a problem in the church, is that too many of us as pastors get on point. Do you know what getting on point means? It's a term that I picked up out of the Vietnam War, reading a book on the Vietnam War, that often when they would go into enemy territory, they would form a triangle. And they would put the newest people at the point. And they would often call that person at the point the FNG, which stands for the blanking new guy. And it's the idea that if you're able to survive that, you can move back in the formation. Getting on point means you're spearheading everything. And so therefore, all the arrows that come to you. Getting off point, most of us have learned in the church that if change is to be, it's up to me. When I come into the church, I'm going to tell them what they need to become. What that does is it makes you the focal point of their resistance and their anger. And to me, the number of pastors that do this and complain about being hurt. And a lot of the pastors I'm working with, I have to help them find a different way of being because so many suffer actual church and vocational trauma because they believe they've been trained from seminary. You've got to go into that church and change them. You know, you've got to make them more social justice minded. So I'm going to preach a social justice sermon to you every Sunday until you change. And then it's like, but why are they so angry at me? I'm just being a prophet. Well, but all the other prophets got hurt too. Another is it also puts us constantly on point where we're initiating change. Being on point always makes the pastor the target. And being on point is the least effective way to lead and often leads to conflict. So let me show you the way it is structurally. And whether this slide helps you or not, just remember it took me 2 hours to put this and the next slide together to figure out how to do this. So very proud of it. What I sort of find is typically, and Lauren, this does sort of go to what you're asking about. What I notice often is if there's a new idea to happen, usually it's the pastor who comes up with it. And often, especially in conflicted situation, the pastor not only has come up with the new idea, we need to change this, but they also have a very clear picture of what everybody else needs to do. So what happens is the pastor has the new idea and then shares it with the leaders. And some leaders quiver and quake, some leaders come along, and some just fade away. And then when the pastor tries to get the members to do it with him, the members scatter. And then they're like, well, I came with a new idea. They said they wanted a new idea. They said they wanted to change. They said they wanted to have. Why did they lie to me? They didn't lie to you. But the way you approached it put you on point. And remember, until you've been there long enough, you're always the outsider. And how many times do you want an outsider to come and tell you what you need to do to change your life? And think about that in terms of the church. A more effective way, it looks more like this. The pastor isn't up front with the idea. The pastor, this isn't quite leading from behind, but the pastor recognizes I'm in a relationship with all of these leaders. And so the pastor may even come up with a full idea, But really, typically what happens is the pastor comes up with a germ of an idea. Or even, I will tell you, even if I have a full-fledged idea, I almost never share the full-fledged idea with people. Remember what I told you in the example about changing from the call to worship to the Taizé thing. I did not come to them with a suggestion on what we ought to do. I came to them with an issue that we need to collectively address. So what I said was, the way we start out, it's very robotic. There are people who are saying we're too noisy and it's not silent enough ahead of time. I think we need to do something. So what do we do? So what that really is, that's the pastor bringing the germ of the idea to other leaders. Now, these other leaders can be committee people, they can be board members, or what I've ended up doing a lot is creating task forces where I will bring the germ of an idea to the board or to a group, and if they're in agreement, then it's let's create a task force that can address this. But you notice I'm not on point. Who's on point? The other leaders of the church, the people they already trust. And so what the leaders do then is typically they form the idea and they take it forward. And I'm kind of back watching what they do. And because they already have relationships with the others, they start attracting the members to their idea. And I am outside of it. I can come in and help them by being an expert. Now, my expertise might be, before, for example, Lauren, before we change the stage, can we go and look at other churches and see what they're doing? It can be, can we look at some kind of resource or book that tells us why it's important to make these kinds of changes? But what I'm doing is I'm getting the leaders to be the one who form the idea. I'm also letting them deal with the resistance. Doesn't mean I won't have any conversation with members and all about what we're trying to do, but usually the conversations I have are supporting what the leaders are doing. So when we changed what we were doing in the beginning of worship, I wasn't out there saying, this is what I want us to do, let's do it. I really allowed, I would write the things in the newsletter and I might make the announcement, but I let the leaders be the one who basically were on point and talking with the other members about why we're doing it. And they would say things like, we're not going to do this. We may not do this forever. We're only saying it's going to be a 3-month experiment. Lisa, you can, just bear with us for 3 months. BJ, just trust us for a little bit, but it's not me out there doing that. Is this making sense? Yeah, go ahead.
Quick question.
Yeah.
What do you do though if you have a congregation that is very pastor focused?
You nurture them to take leadership. You teach and train them to take leadership. And you do not, even though, you can share what you think, but you can also say, that's what I think. What are you all thinking in response? Resist the temptation if they say, well, we want to do what you want. Resist that temptation and say, okay, I'll make it clear, but this has to be all of us together or we don't do it at all. Lauren, I don't know if that's a helpful answer or do you have more detail on the question?
No, I think that is.
Yeah, and so I don't want to put you on point right now, but does it feel like you're sometimes on point on this? Yeah, and I think then step back, slow it down, and let other leaders be the ones who defend it. Let them be the ones who talk to the congregation. And you can tell them, look, if this doesn't work, we can spend the money to go back to the way it was. I mean, that may not happen. It's probably not going to happen. But, there are other ways around it. The thing is, you're trying to do this as a body, not as an individual. Yeah, Don.
I was just saying that I think sometimes, too, our own issues and fear couple together
Yes.
to get us in that, we'll let it go for a little while, but then, we know if it's actually going to happen, we need to get back on.
Yeah.
So it's that constant wrestling with, pulling back and being comfortable with, this might fail.
So, yeah, and I'll tell you the model I use in talking about this. I often say to people, as pastors, we've all come out of seminaries which have taught us the prophetic model where we've got to be prophets. I appreciate Walter Brueggemann's book, The Prophetic Imagination. I also appreciate the fact that he was ordained as a pastor. I also appreciate the fact he didn't run a church. And I say this because the prophets are not a good model for our ministry. What happened to all the prophets? Well, this also happened to the apostles. Typically they would come in, drop a truth bomb, and run to the desert afterwards. And, that's what we do. We go in, drop a truth bomb, and then have to run somewhere because they're now attacking us. The New Testament model is the apostolic. Go in, get to know people, eat their food, even food sacrificed to idols, which for me is like having to eat half a butternut squash, even though I hate it, but that's what they're serving. It is learning their language, learning their customs, learning about them, and then nurturing us to go forward. That's actually the model for ministry of the New Testament, but often we don't follow that model. We think we have to get on point. And I just will tell you, that prophetic model, it's hard to find a church that's prophetic that's also growing unless it's a prophet preaching to the choir. In other words, you can be a very successful prophetic pastor if you're conservative or progressive, if everybody in your church is thinking exactly the same as you, and then they like it. But the point of a prophet is not to share a message that everybody likes. It's to share a message that transforms. Yeah, go ahead, BJ.
Okay, so how do you deal with it if you are kind of like creating tasks or creating a group that you're assigning a project to, handing a project off to them? And a couple thoughts. What if there's somebody in that group that is just they want to lead, they're going to do it their way, and they don't want to be a team player?
Yep.
Or what do you do?
Before you go to the second one, can I address that one?
Yes.
Okay. I've run into that. Now, I recognize I've been trained as a marital therapist and family therapist, so I know how to reframe what people are saying. In other workshops, I have taught a method of what I call it validate them. Don't validate their idea. But if somebody goes, we should stay the same, I might say, I really appreciate what you're saying, because I think what you're saying to all of us, don't be so quick to make changes. There are things that are valuable. And so I think it's important for us to pay attention to what you're saying. But I also think it's important to the others. That's the second part. Open it up. The third part is I often summarize, what I'm hearing you say, and then I move to the last part, which is collaborate. VOSC, validate, open up, summarize, collaborate. If you say something, I will try to validate you, not your thought, but you. BJ, I appreciate your faith, and I really appreciate the fact that you're on this task force, because I think you're an important voice for us to hear. In that, you're also hearing me say, but you're not the only one. And then I open it up. What do you all think about what BJ said? Now I'm forcing you into relationship with them instead of with the moderator and you being that. I often will summarize what each person says. So what I'm hearing you say is this, what I'm hearing you say is this, and then it's collaborate. Now that we've heard all the voices, is there a way to bring this together to create a new idea? Is that helpful?
It is.
It's easy for me to say that.
Yeah.
It's hard to do it
Yeah.
because we start getting anxious and defensive and all that.
Yeah.
So what was the second question?
Layer of that
Yeah.
was, what if you find
I think the main thing is, and this is for you to figure out how to do it. Again, this is what I do, is helping people figure out things. So I have no problems if people want contact to talk about this more in depth. Hopefully not everybody contacts me all at once, because that may be tough. But there's also a book that I would like you all to read. To me, it's one of the best books in terms of understanding how to turn around a church. And it has nothing to do with church. There's a book called Drive by Daniel Pink. He is an organizational psychologist and organizational psychologist, where he studies what helps things grow. And he talks, you can find a video of him if you really want to get a 10-minute synopsis of what he says in the book. If you put Daniel Pink Drive video, don't go to his TED Talk, because the TED Talk, he really stays with only one of his points. But look for what's called an RSA video. It's one where they draw cartoons as you talk. It's very fascinating. But he says if you want an organization to grow, that you need to learn Motivation 3.0. That Motivation 1.0 is do what I say or I'm going to hurt you. Motivation 2.0 is do what I say or I'm going to hurt you, but if you do well, I'm going to reward you. Motivation 3.0 is get people involved in things that are self-motivating. Churches are organizations that require self-motivation. And he says the three most important things if you want something to grow is for people to feel like they have autonomy, mastery, and a sense of meaning and purpose. Autonomy is what we just talked about. Autonomy is we can do this on our own and we don't need the supervisor or the boss or anybody else. They can be there, but they're not required to be there. I have the autonomy to make decisions. A lot of times in churches, we don't nurture that kind of autonomy. We feel like we have to be in control. A second thing is mastery. Mastery is, it's going to bring me meaning and purpose because I feel like I can use my skills that help with this, or by doing this, it will help me develop skills. So a large part of what we would do is, so I wanted our church to be more welcoming. So we created a greeting team. And part of the greeting team was you had to undergo an hour training. And the hour training was not head training, it was participatory. We had people pretending like they're visitors coming in, and we trained them how to be really welcoming. If you go to most evangelical churches, you'll notice they greet you at the entrance to the driveway, they greet you in the parking lot, they greet you at the front door, they greet you going into the sanctuary. I went and visited a church called Amplify last summer, and I was talking to one of the guys in the parking lot, and I asked how many were on the greeting team, and he said probably 60 or 70 people in the church. Because they said it's important. But what I noticed was there was no pastor out there telling them what to do. There was no supervisor. Each person knew what they were doing, and they looked at what they were doing as, I can develop the skills for this. And I asked him about the training. He said, well, I don't do much training anymore. But he said, when I started, they did it. But now I can just bring out my own personality. The final thing is meaning and purpose. That if people feel like they have a sense of autonomy, that they have a sense of mastery over what they're doing, and what they're doing gives them a sense of meaning and purpose, they will be passionate about what they do and they will do it. One of the reasons it's harder and harder to find people who, one of the reasons why it's harder and harder to find people who will take up collections in churches, they have autonomy. Mastery, what kind of mastery do they really need? I mean, one Sunday and you've got it figured out. Meaning and purpose, most people just don't feel a sense of meaning and purpose. I know this is taboo, what I'm about to say, but we faced that where we couldn't get ushers to do it. And we had created a greeting team, but they didn't want to take up the collection, so we got rid of the offering. We basically did online offering. We put stuff in the bulletin telling them how they can give to us out of that. We turned the offering time into a meditation time where they just listened. We invited people to listen to a piece of music after the sermon and reflect, and our giving never went down. It actually went up a little bit. We still put an offering plate in the back of the church with a sign over it saying, thank you so much for contributing to the ministry of Calvin Presbyterian Church. You make a big difference. But really, it was the frustration every Sunday of me having to go find somebody to be an usher who didn't want to do it. Okay, I'll do it this time, Graham, but not after that. Do you think we can get that hooked? Is that for this or is that for your computer? Okay, good. No, it's okay. I thought you were going to help me, but no. I would really encourage you to watch the video and to read the book, because this will help you learn how to do, not that, but it will teach you how to learn to do this. Because what I'm doing when I do this, I have a germ of an idea, I bring it to them, I tell them, you guys can flesh this out. It helps them to think about it. When I consult with churches, by having them read things, we're not only giving them autonomous thinking, but we're giving them mastery by increasing their knowledge. And then the other thing is, by being part of it and then doing it, it gives them a sense of meaning and purpose, that when they're out there developing the idea and taking it, it gives them a great sense of meaning and purpose to not only construct it, but to bring other people along.
We give those leaders permission to fail.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's funny because somebody asked me one time, I was giving a workshop and somebody said, well, it sounds like all you have is success after success. And they'd say, can you talk about times that it hasn't worked? And I thought for a while, and I go, I think I've only been successful about 30% of the time, but honestly, I can't tell you about the times I fail because I don't linger on my failures. I learn from them and I move on. We created a worship service that did communion, like Jill, communion every Sunday. We started a second service that did communion every Sunday. And we also had both wine and grape juice. Not very Presbyterian, but we figured a third of our members were former Lutherans, Catholics, and Episcopalians. Not many Episcopalians, but and so we thought this will help them, reconnect with their spiritual experiences from where they're coming from. It worked really well. Actually, when we would combine our services in the summer, people said they didn't like coming to the service because they didn't get to do communion every Sunday. And so they would skip the services where they didn't have communion. So we thought, well, this is great. Well, let's do it in both our services. So we ran an experiment, to do it every Sunday. And we were going to do it for 3 months. A woman named Betty in our church, my God, did she bend my ear every Sunday about how that's so Catholic and and all of that kind of stuff. And basically after a month, I said, I can't take it anymore. Is it okay if we end this experiment and just go back? Another thing was, we have a tremendous amount of musical talent at Calvin Church, but we decided to try doing contemporary. So we did contemporary once a month. And, the people who like contemporary loved it because we had a lot of really good musicians. But we were going to do it for 10 months and we pulled the plug after 4 months because the musicians were saying, we don't like this. We're able to play not only traditional and contemporary, but we can play jazz and blues and Celtic and everything else. And it felt too confining. Technically, that's a failure, but it helped us to open it up. I think, if I'm, let's say I'm 40% successful in everything I've tried, if I'm a baseball player, that puts me in the Hall of Fame. I think you can't go forward without failing. The question is, do you set it up so that if you fail, so often what would happen is that experiment with the communion, we pulled the plug after, instead of 6 months, we pulled the plug after 1 month. And I wrote a letter to the congregation telling them that and thanking them so much for being a church that allows us to experiment, that allows us to try things. It doesn't stop things before we try them, but allows us. And I said, we tried it. We were going to go 6 months. It's clearly not working, but we are so grateful to you. Again, it's relational and building trust. So what happens is we try something new. Next time, they don't feel like it's permanent, but they feel like, yeah, if this doesn't work, they'll cut it. And so we turn those failures into positives.